We start with the new bill that was introduced in the United States House of Representatives that has proposed the repeal of the 2-decade-old sanctions regime against Zimbabwe, marking a potential shift in Washington's policy towards Harare. Now, the proposed legislation, known as the Department of State Policy Provisions Act, sets out a provision for repealing the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act of 2001, which has been the legal foundation for U.S. sanctions against Zimbabwe since its enactment. Now, our correspondent Eben Mabunda spoke to some analysts on this development and filed the following report.
For more than 20 years, ZDERA has required the U.S. to oppose loans, debt relief or financial assistance to Zimbabwe from international institutions. This effectively locked the country out of the critical global financial system. Now, Washington has moved to repeal the act, which was first enacted in 2001, sparking discussion in Harare. The repeal comes with strict conditions tied to Zimbabwe's compensation of former commercial farmers under the Global Compensation Deed. The bill stipulates that Washington will not support any fresh IMF or World Bank funding for Zimbabwe unless the government commits to fully compensating white former commercial farmers in line with the Global Compensation Deed. This, however, comes at a time when the country has already started to compensate the farmers who lost their land during the agrarian reform. While the bill is set to undergo several stages and debate before being finally passed into law, political analyst Dr. Mataruse believes the move by Washington represents significant wins for Zimbabwe.
So what this particularly means, yes, it is one of the best fruits of the president's multi-pronged foreign policy approach. The issue of re-engagement, engagement with multiple countries, moving us from a situation of being isolated.
The Global Compensation Deed signed in 2020 committed Zimbabwe to pay $3.5 billion to former white farmers, specifically for improvements on repossessed farms. The latest stance by the U.S. ties the country's economic recovery prospects to meeting this obligation within strict timelines. Economist Mishek Ugaro is of the view that the repeal will improve Zimbabwe's credit rating and open new opportunities for the country.
And it's not an insurmountable issue, because the fact that the government already signed this agreement is already a commitment. What is important is the impact of this move on the credit rating of this country. This de-risks this country, which means opportunities to raise funding.
Beyond Zimbabwe, the bill also touches on countries such as China, Belarus and Somalia, meaning its passage through the US system would trigger wider geopolitical discussions.
Actually longer than a year, because of it's not just about Zimbabwe. No, some people are just thinking that it's about Zimbabwe. It's clearly not about Zimbabwe. It's about U.S. foreign policy. It is a very complicated foreign policy approach. It's likely to be debated longer in the U.S. Parliament or the U.S. House of Representatives.
Over the years, the SADC bloc has rallied behind Zimbabwe for the removal of the ZDERA sanctions. Now, experts believe the possible repeal could also reshape Harare's international relations.
A landmark development, a landmark political development that should be celebrated by all and sundry in this country. Why it should be celebrated? Without a doubt, sanctions were and are still harming this country. They are stalling sustainable economic development.
Analysts say the clause tying Zimbabwe's access to international credit lines to compensation payments could become a sticking point in negotiations between Harare and Washington. If ZDERA sanctions are successfully repealed, what remains are the Magnitsky sanctions, which target Zimbabwe's president, the chief of police, and several other key businesses operating in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe's re-engagement efforts with the United States are expected to continue, as a 12 to 18-month legislative process is expected to ensue in the United States governance, while Zimbabwe's treasury will seek to resolve the $3.5 billion obligation owed to former farm owners. Ibn Mabunda, reporting for ZTN Prime in Zimbabwe's capital, Harare.
And now, to further analyze this latest development, we cross over live to political analyst Gibson Nyikadzino, who's based at Uppsala University in Sweden. Good evening, Gibson. What does this mean for Zimbabwe from an economic standpoint?
Thank you so much for the pertinent question. I think before we look at what it means economically, we need to decode that the biggest gesture we are seeing from this is that both countries are keen on the normalization of relations, and also it means Zimbabwe has worked hard to highlight the importance of its friend of all and enemy of none, the mantra in its foreign policy. And when we look at it from an economic point of view, I think you would understand that for almost 25 years, Zimbabwe has lived under the stain of punitive measures, and through diplomatic engagements, we see that the European Union, Britain, they eased and relaxed and also removed entities and individuals on their sanctions list. And this was something that was only left up to the United States, though there are key areas that also need redress. But this helps in priming Zimbabwe as a investment destination. Remember, we're a key player in the green energy transition because of our lithium reserves and other key minerals, rare earth minerals, which are critical components in the defense industry, the security sector, among other things.
Now, Gibson, there's a catch to this stance: cash payment to former farm owners within 12 months. Is this something that's actually feasible?
Then when you look at the idea of the feasibility of the cash payments to the farmers, we need to understand that this gesture, which has been signaled by the United States, it was never thought of as something that should happen in our lifetime, but it really happened. So I'm not trying to give a picture that we need to think for the government, but you know, governments as systems, they are so complex that what might deem unfeasible, at one point it might be something feasible. So we really need to take cue from how the government will approach this gesture from now, because time frames are also important, but also these time frames can be negotiated. I think from across the political divide, there's been a surprise, especially in the national political landscape, where from the onset people used to say the United States will not do anything to lift sanctions. Of course, there is concern that the head of state remains as a target, but we understand this is a beginning of relations which are taking a reset. So I think this is important for all of us as Zimbabwe.
Thank you and good evening. That was Gibson Nyikadzino sharing his insights on the repealing of the Zimbabwe Sanctions Act.